They say the West is a land of forgetting, that the wind erases footprints and the sun burns away guilt. But not here. Not at the edge of this broken ranch where time curled in on itself like old rope and where silence lived longer than men. For 8 long years, no one had knocked on Malachi Thorne's door, and that suited him just fine. He'd built these walls not from wood, but from regret. A sheriff's badge rusted in a drawer, a bottle always half empty, and a name he hadn't spoken aloud since the day he lost her, Sarah. Her name still tasted like smoke and sorrow. Malachi hadn't raised his voice in years, nor his hopes. He kept to his cattle, his dust, his ghosts. The law had once been his compass until it pointed him straight into betrayal. Since then, he'd let the world spin without him. But that changed one stormy night. The kind of night where thunder feels like judgment and the rain tries to wash something deeper than dirt. She appeared like a vision pulled from fevered memory. A woman in white, barefoot, bruised, breathless. Her wedding dress clung to her like a mistake she couldn't outrun. She collapsed at his doorstep, too weak to speak, too desperate to explain. And in that moment between the lightning and the wind, Malachi stood frozen. Not because he feared her, but because she reminded him of a promise he'd once failed to keep. This wasn't just about saving a stranger. It was about deciding whether a man buried by silence could still stand for something. Whether justice forgotten, rusted, and worn could rise from a place like this. Because sometimes the knock at the door isn't a person. It's your past asking if you're still alive. And when Malachi opened that door, he didn't just let her in. He let the story begin. They called him a ghost long before he started acting like one. Malachi Thorne hadn't been seen in town for nearly a decade. His ranch, 2 miles past the ridge, nestled behind dying mesquite trees, stood still under the weight of time. The roof sagged like an old man's shoulders. The fences had gaps wide enough for the wind to walk through. But it was his eyes, if you ever got close enough to see them, that truly told the story, not empty, not angry, but abandoned. He hadn't always been that way. Once he rode with purpose. A star on his chest spine, straight words few but firm. Sheriff Thorne had been the kind of man you trusted your children with in a stampede. He'd built a name the hard way, earned by sweat and sacrifice. But no one earns immunity from grief. And when it came for him, it didn't knock. Sarah's disappearance had left no blood, no witness, no grave. Just silence. And silence, if you live in it long enough, stops being absence. It becomes a companion. Malachi didn't curse the world. He didn't curse Sarah. He just stopped. Stopped hoping. Stopped chasing. Stopped speaking. And that silence wrapped around him like a second skin. Neighbors stopped coming. Letters stopped arriving. The law passed to younger, hungrier hands. And Malachi, he simply faded. The only sound left in his world was the creak of the porch swing he never sat in, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the old mare he kept feeding out of habit rather than affection. He didn't know why he kept her. Maybe because she too had no one else. Some mornings he'd talk to her not in full sentences, but in fragments. Storm's coming. Still here, huh? Me too. He never expected answers, just like he never expected company. So when the knock came soft but urgent, like rain before the thunder, it didn't register at first. He thought it was wind. Then the second knock came. He stood from the table slowly, his body remembering how to move through rusted memory. And there she was, kneeling on the porch like a fallen prayer. Soaked, shaking eyes, wild with the kind of fear that doesn't have words yet. Malachi didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He just opened the door. Because when you've been silent long enough, you start to hear things other men miss. And what he saw wasn't just a woman, it was a second chance. The first thing Malachi noticed wasn't her face. It was the mud on her hem, thick red, clinging like blood that hadn't quite dried. Then her hands scraped raw. Then the sound of her breath, shallow and broken, like a hymn sung by someone who'd forgotten the words. She didn't say her name. Not yet. And he didn't ask. Instead, he wrapped an old wool blanket around her trembling shoulders, the same one he used when winter nights got too cruel. He led her inside. The room was warm only by contrast, the fire long gone out. the air still heavy with dust, but to someone who'd run through a storm, even stillness can feel like safety. She didn't sit. She curled. On the floor near the hearth, knees pulled to her chest like she might vanish if she unfolded. Only the ticking of an old clock filled the room. Minutes passed before she whispered, "Clayton." The word wasn't a name, it was a wound. And Malachi, though he hadn't spoken more than 2 words to a soul in months, understood. Because sometimes a single name carries a whole lifetime of fear. He crouched near her, careful not to touch. "You hungry?" She nodded once, barely. He gave her bread, old dry but enough. And in that moment, watching her eat, she was afraid someone might take it away. He realized this wasn't just a woman on the run. This was a woman who had been owned, traded. Like cattle, like land, like something that could be dressed in lace and chained with gold. The dress, white elegant once, was now just a costume. It had lost its meaning. Or maybe it never had one. Malachi didn't ask questions. He let her tell the story with silence, with glances toward the door, with the way she flinched every time the wind howled against the walls. But eventually, when she did speak, it came out like water from a burst dam. "I was supposed to marry him today." She didn't cry. Not yet. But I ran. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. And Malachi didn't need more. Because whatever this girl was fleeing, it wasn't just a man. It was a system, a sickness, something that dressed up ownership as love and forced women into cages made of etiquette and expectation. She looked up at him finally, fully, eyes searching for judgment. But Malachi only said, "You're safe here. For now." Because that was all he could promise. And as the rain softened outside, as the storm moved farther off into the hills, both of them knew. This wasn't the end of her flight. It was only the beginning. She hadn't meant to say his name again, but it kept slipping out like a splinter buried too deep to pull. "Clayton Voss," she muttered, as if spitting it out might cleanse her. "His money built half this town and buried the other half." Malachi knew the name. Everyone did. You couldn't live within 50 miles of Dry Creek without feeling the weight of it. Clayton didn't own the land. He owned the silence that grew around it. Banks, deputies, judges, even preachers knew to pause before speaking too boldly against a man like Voss. "Debt," Evangeline whispered, "is just another way to chain people. My father owed him, and I was the payment." Her voice cracked, but not from tears. She wasn't weak. She was tired. In the way a woman gets when every door she's knocked on has been slammed shut behind her. Malachi didn't press her. He just listened. And in that listening, a picture began to form, more chilling than anything he'd imagined. Her father, once a proud rancher, had gambled with drought and lost. Clayton had offered him a deal, one he never truly understood until it was too late. And Evangeline, barely 16, then became the collateral. Not in name, not in law, but in whispers, contracts, and expectations. By the time she turned 18, the marriage was arranged. No church bells, just ownership paper dressed in lace. "I thought I could endure it," she said, eyes fixed on the crackling fire. "I thought maybe if I just stayed quiet enough, obedient enough, he'd forget to use me like a prize horse on auction day." But the ceremony had come. Guests, champagne, and her name called like cattle as she stood at the edge of a life she hadn't chosen. That was when she ran. Malachi looked at the flames dancing across the hearth. Debt, he thought, isn't always about money. Sometimes it's paid in skin, in freedom, in silence. He remembered what it was like to owe the past, to let it rule your days like a shadow too large to outrun. Evangeline didn't need pity. She needed protection. And for the first time in years, Malachi felt something stir that hadn't moved in a long time. Not rage, not revenge, conviction. Because if one man's name could buy silence, then maybe another man's silence could finally break it. And just as the thought settled in his chest, there came a knock 6 times, steady and low. When Malachi opened the door again, it wasn't the storm that had returned. It was 6 young women cloaked in dirt and desperation, their eyes fierce, their feet bleeding. And behind them was a truth too large for one night to hold. Clayton Voss didn't ride like a man. He glided saddle-polished boots, clean not a speck of dust on the silver buckle he wore like a sheriff's star, though he'd never earned one. That was Clayton Power without effort, wrist bought, not built. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted. He whispered and towns folded. His family had arrived in Dry Creek decades ago, back when bloodlines were currency and land was taken more often than bought. By the time he inherited his father's empire, most folks had either borrowed from the Vosses or worked land that once belonged to them. But wealth alone wasn't what made Clayton feared. It was the way he wore morality like a tailored coat, always just tight enough to imply virtue, but loose enough to hide the knife underneath. He dressed like a gentleman, spoke like a preacher, and punished like a warlord. What terrified people wasn't that he'd hurt you himself. It was that he never had to. One word from him, and someone else's hands would do the breaking. One raised eyebrow, and debts would double. One fake smile at a public gathering, and suddenly your wife couldn't buy medicine or your son was denied work. He didn't scream when Evangeline ran, didn't chase her on horseback or send dogs. He simply waited sipping bourbon from a crystal glass, certain she'd return, because they always did. The desperate, the indebted, the broken, they always came crawling back. But this time something was different. When word reached him that Evangeline had fled into the hills, had sought shelter with a ghost of a man named Malachi Thorne, Clayton didn't react with anger. He reacted with calculation. Malachi, he'd said with a dry chuckle, didn't know he still had a spine. But beneath that mocking tone was a flicker of something else. Not rage, not revenge, fear, because a man like Malachi couldn't be bought. And that meant he was dangerous. Clayton knew that real power doesn't scream, it waits. So he waited. He tightened the noose around the town, pressured the mayor, called in favors, bought silence, bought eyes, bought bullets. But even the richest man can't buy what's already broken free. And when those 6 women appeared alongside Evangeline, each with their own story, each a ghost risen from Clayton's past, he knew this wasn't about a runaway bride anymore. It was about a reckoning. Because sometimes privilege looks like control, and sometimes it's just fear in a prettier suit. Malachi Thorne had always believed that time was a river, that if you let it flow long enough, it would carry away the weight of your worst mistakes. But now, staring at 6 young women huddled in his barn clothes, torn of voices trembling, he realized something he hadn't let himself consider for years. Some things don't wash away. Some rivers run backward. Each girl carried her story like a scar. Different names, different seasons, same monster. And as they spoke, hesitant at first, then with the growing fire of shared survival, Malachi felt the air around him shift. The barn was no longer just a shelter from the rain. It was a courtroom. And he wasn't just a protector anymore. He was a man on trial by the silence of his own past, because once long ago, Malachi had worn a badge. And during that time, he'd heard whispers about missing girls, about men with money who settled things out of sight. He'd told himself then it wasn't his jurisdiction, that hearsay wasn't justice. But deep down, he knew. He'd looked away. He had failed them. He thought silence was safer, that by keeping his distance from power, he was staying clean. But now, with 6 pairs of eyes staring at him, some pleading, some accusing, he realized silence can be its own kind of violence. The oldest of the women, Clara, stepped forward. She held out something wrapped in a kerchief, a silver brooch engraved with the Voss family crest. He gave this to my sister before she vanished. Said it was a promise. Said he'd take care of her. Her sister never came back. Malachi took the brooch with shaking hands. It was identical to the one Sarah had worn the night she disappeared. A name scratched the edge of his memory. A moment. A possibility too painful to voice. But something inside him shifted. Not just guilt. Resolve. Because sometimes justice isn't about revenge. It's about facing the things you've buried and standing tall when they come for you. Malachi stood slowly. He looked each of them in the eye. I can't undo what's been done, he said. But I won't be silent again. Not now, not with this. And with that, the ghost of a man began to become something else. Not quite a sheriff, not yet a savior, but a man choosing to face the fire he once feared, because the past once unearthed demands more than sorrow. It demands action. For years, Malachi Thorne had believed he was done with the law. The badge he once wore sat buried in a box beneath floorboards, alongside a yellowed letter from his wife and a photograph so sun-faded you could barely make out her face. He hadn't touched that box in 8 years. But on the morning after Clara's story, after 6 truths bled into one long night of reckoning, Malachi found himself kneeling on the hardwood, lifting the floorboards with slow, deliberate hands. Dust coated the badge like time trying to erase responsibility. But time, he now knew, only delays judgment. It never denies it. He held the badge in his palm, its edges colder than he remembered. And as the sun rose through the cracks in his shuttered window, the light caught the tarnished brass like it was asking him a question. "Are you still the man who ran from this, out on the porch?" The 6 women stood together, silent but watching. Evangeline had taken the lead, her back straight, her chin lifted like someone who had nothing left to lose. They didn't ask what he would do. They had already told him enough. It was his turn to answer. But duty, he'd learned, was heavier than guilt. To act now meant war, not just with Voss, but with the systems that had protected him. The judges he drank with. The lawmen he paid. The preacher who blessed his land deals while ignoring his sins. To act meant putting everything and everyone at risk. And Malachi knew this wasn't just about right and wrong anymore. It was about how much right you were willing to bleed for. He saddled his horse in silence, strapped on the old revolver he hadn't fired in years. The weight on his hip was familiar, but sobering. Clara met his gaze. "If you go back to town, they'll come for you," she said. Malachi didn't flinch. "They already did," he replied softly. 8 years ago. He turned to the youngest of the group, Lena, no older than 17, her cheeks still bruised from a man paid to deliver silence. "You don't owe us anything," she whispered. "No," Malachi answered. "But I owe myself the man I was supposed to be." And that was the moment the ghost became a lawman again. Not because the town gave him permission, not because a badge gave him power, but because truth, when seen clearly, demands a reckoning. He rode toward Dry Creek not for justice alone, but for redemption. Not just for them, but for her. For Sarah. And maybe, just maybe, the man he could still become. It wasn't a courthouse. It wasn't a battlefield. It was just an old ranch house at the edge of forgotten land, weathered wood. A sagging porch, a door that creaked like it remembered every secret ever whispered beneath its roof. And yet that morning it became something more. It became the line in the sand, the place where silence ended. Malachi Thorne didn't come back alone. Behind him rode a U.S. Marshal, grizzled, skeptical, but willing to listen after the evidence Malachi had unearthed, testimonies, trinkets, and names whispered too long in fear. The women followed too, not hiding in shadows this time, but standing in the sun, where bruises turned to badges of survival. Clara took up a post by the doorway, one hand on the rifle Malachi had lent her. Evangeline sat at the window, eyes scanning the road. Lena braided her hair with trembling fingers, as if to gather strength in every twist. Inside, Malachi laid the papers on the table. Voss's crest, the journal pages torn from a housemaid's Bible. A signed letter from a preacher's wife who could no longer carry the guilt of what she'd known and said nothing about. All of it ready for the marshal. All of it waiting for the law to breathe again. But the law was late. And the devil came first. They heard the horses before they saw them. 20 men all dressed in black dusters, rifles strapped, eyes cold. Voss wasn't with them, not yet. He never showed his face until the world was already burning. Malachi stood on the porch. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he raised the badge, the one that hadn't gleamed in years. He held it like a torch, like a warning. And for a moment, the riders hesitated. Not because they feared the badge, but because they feared what it represented, a man who had nothing left to lose except his soul. "They've told their stories," Malachi said, his voice like gravel wrapped in steel. "And this time someone's going to listen." A shot cracked in the distance. Not from the men in black, but from the ridge. A second group appeared. Locals, townsfolk, a few old deputies, even the preacher's son. People who had once looked away, now they came with their own truths, their own regrets, their own reckonings. Because sometimes one house can hold more than just survivors. It can hold a conscience. And when enough hearts beat in unison, even if they're scarred, even if they're scared, they become something unbreakable. A fortress. The sound of hooves on hard earth is different when it's hope that rides in. It doesn't thunder, it pulses. Like a heartbeat long forgotten. Like a promise made by a better version of the world. That morning, as the sun pushed through the storm clouds, still trailing the night before Malachi, Thorne stood on his porch, unsure if he was waiting for rescue or a reckoning. Either would have been honest. But what came next was something else entirely. At first, just one man rode into view. Marshal Elias Whitmore. His coat was weathered, his face graver than the law books he once carried like scripture. But this time he wasn't alone. Behind him rode men and women from Dry Creek, and beyond, former deputies, off-duty lawmen, a Lakota scout with a scar across his jaw, and even a young boy named David, who had once watched his sister vanish into one of Clayton Voss's wagons. They came not because they were summoned, but because justice, when delayed too long, becomes a hunger people can't ignore. The badge, it turned out, still meant something, not when worn, but when earned. Marshal Whitmore dismounted, eyes locked with Malachi's. "You're late," Malachi muttered with a half-smile. "I had to be sure," the marshal replied. "This time, we do it right." Inside, the women gathered, clutching hands, holding breath. Some wept, not from fear, but from the release of it. They had waited so long to be believed that belief itself felt like a foreign language. Clara stepped forward, handing over the documents. The evidence Malachi had risked everything to retrieve. "We're ready," she said, voice steadier than any courtroom oath. Then a quiet sound behind them. Bootsteps, soft, hesitant. Evangeline turned. Her mother, once too ashamed to speak, now too brave to stay silent, had arrived. Behind her, the banker's wife, the tailor's daughter, the school teacher who'd once taught Evangeline to read. They had all come, quietly, carefully, but unmistakably. Because when the badge returns, not just pinned to a chest, but planted in a town's conscience, it draws out more than justice. It calls forth those who have stayed quiet too long. It makes allies out of bystanders. And it reminds us that silence is a choice, one we can choose to break. And so the porch that once held only ghosts now held a gathering, a rising, a reckoning stitched together by scars and courage. And in the distance, for the first time in years, the gallows stood empty, because truth had finally found a voice louder than fear. The town quieted, but not from fear. The guns had fallen silent, the shadows retreating like cowards before the sunrise. And in the stillness that followed, something deeper stirred, something gentler, more fragile than any verdict or vengeance. Love. Not the kind written in letters or sung about in saloons. Not the love of fairy tales or reckless hearts. This was a quieter thing. Earned, weathered, scarred but standing. The kind of love that grows not in spite of brokenness, but because of it. Malachi sat on the porch again. Same spot, same creaking floorboards beneath him. But this time, there was a second rocking chair. Clara sat beside him, a blanket across her shoulders, the morning light touching the edges of her tired smile. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost in his own skin. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Around them, the ranch breathed. It had seen blood, fire, and silence. But now, it heard laughter. Evangeline played cards with the school teacher's boy. Lena was baking in the kitchen with more flour on her face than in the bowl. Even the hoarse old Cooper trotted a little lighter. But perhaps the truest sign of healing came in the way Clara looked at Malachi, not as a man who had saved them, not as a lawman or a warrior or a shield, just as a man, one who stayed. And for Malachi, who once believed his story ended in silence and shadows, this moment felt like rebellion, a soft defiance against the years that told him love was no longer his to hold. He had chosen justice, yes, but now he chose something harder, to rebuild. To remain, to risk love again, not the easy kind, but the kind born of shared pain and open hands. Later that evening, they lit a fire, not for warmth, but for remembrance, for every name that didn't survive, for every voice that had been silenced, and for the truth that even in a world made of dust and judgment, something beautiful could still rise. Because sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is not fight, but stay. Long after the gunpowder faded and the footprints vanished into prairie grass, the dust remained. But not empty, not forgotten, because the land remembers. And so must we. Stories like Malachi Thorne's weren't meant to be legends tucked away in leather-bound books or passed around by old men at whiskey-soaked tables. They were never about glory. They were about grit, about what happens when ordinary people, flawed, haunted, unsure, choose to stand anyway. A rancher who thought his time had passed. A runaway bride who refused to be silent. A house that once echoed with ghosts, now filled with hope. These aren't just characters. They're mirrors. In a world that still wrestles with power and silence, with justice and fear, these stories remind us that the line between cowardice and courage is often just one decision wide. They remind us that redemption is not given. It's chosen. That love, no matter how late it arrives, is still worth saying yes to. That sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is listen to those we were taught to ignore. And maybe, just maybe, that's these dusty old westerns still hit us right in the chest. Because they aren't about the past. They're warnings. They're invitations. They whisper, you've got your own porch, your own silence, your own storm bride knocking. What will you do when they come? So if this story stirred something in you, if you saw a piece of yourself in Malachi or Clara, or even in the frightened townsfolk who learned to do better, don't let that feeling vanish when the credits roll. Let it linger. Let it guide. Let it change how you walk into the next hard conversation or the next quiet moment. And if you're hungry for more stories like this, where history breathes, where the dust speaks, where the forgotten find voice, then stay with us. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a chapter. Like this video if it moved you. And in the next story, we'll take you even deeper into the heart of another forgotten frontier, where justice rode in late, but love still waited at the gate. Until then, may your silence be broken, your fires rekindled, and your story never forgotten. We'll see you on the trail.